Want to come sit here? And then also, Linda, just accept people also as they are joining. I've made you the, so now they're joining. Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that.
Because I've also made co-host.
Okay.
That's fine. Sorry, there's like a lot of wirings. I feel it's repeated. I'm just going to put it in. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right.
Tracy,
Yes.
please let me know when I should begin the program.
Yes, yes. Yes, Yes, what's one thing I can just say? Sorry, Linda, now just said, no, we're just gonna give people some 10 more minutes to just join, because everybody was still accessing the link. Then we will start, but I will notify you.
Okay, Tracy, I'll just wait for your signal.
Thank you. But we can just maybe ready to share some it's this one. This is the one that you're sharing. But it's shared now. It's not what I'm saying when you want the presentation. Yes. By this, yeah, because I mean, three, there's a 3-4 minutes. Okay, so we just want 3 minutes. Okay. Thank you. I hope Linda can hear me. I hope they can hear the building. Yes. Good afternoon, colleagues and students. We are going to make a start. Dr. Linda, see. Dr. Linda, your mic is muted. Dr. Linda.
Tracy?
Yes, I'm not able to hear you. We can make a start. You just mute yourself again.
Okay. It's a very good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to our Act CJ seminar presentation. Thank you for taking time to attend this presentation by Dr. Anzanele Funomunyai, who is a senior lecturer here at Act CJ. At this point, I would like to acknowledge the presence of our Dean, Professor Jacques Deville. Prof, thank you very much for your usual support for our research activities here at Act CJ. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to Professor John Mark E., our director at Act CJ, for the opening remarks. My name is Dr. Linda Mushoriwa, and I am a researcher here at Act CJ. Prof. John Mark E., please go ahead and give the opening remarks. Thank you.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you for joining us on this occasion of our third Act CJ seminar. Good afternoon, Dean Professor Jacques Deville and research students at the African Center for Transnational Criminal Justice, and all other colleagues who have taken time out to join us in this event. It's in our to present a seminar in every quarter, and this will be third to be presented this year by researchers at the African Center for Transnational Criminal Justice. The presentation this afternoon will be by no other than our esteemed colleague, Dr. Anza Muriai, and she will be talking to us about corruption and neo-colonialism obstacles to the development of Africa. Just by way of opening remarks, our center focuses on transnational criminal justice, specifically, but more broadly, issues of international law and various aspects of legal interactions between Africa and the rest of the world, and of course, politics as well. As you very much aware, man by nature is a political animal. And so his existence is almost always defined by two major elements, politics and economics. In the case of Africa, this is even more so because of the history of the continent. And that history still very much haunts the continent today, and the history of slavery and slave trade and the history of colonization. In this, the legal and political structures that were put in place at the end of formal colonization were such that they created an Africa that is formally independent, but still substantively dependent, in the sense that while Africa is formally seen to be independent on paper, in theory, it seems to be independent, but in reality, in political terms and economic terms, the continent still very much not a sovereign continent, as it were. And people have adduced this to different reasons, and we'll be hearing more about that from our colleague. But just to highlight that the topic is one of the most complex I would say, topics that African researchers and, of course, researchers around the world interested in African affairs try to grapple, in the sense of how do we first we identify that there is a problem, but the problem of how corruption, political corruption, for example, how it undermines economic development and its impact, though generally acknowledged in the research, established in the research, but the actual measurement of the impact of corruption is difficult to establish. There are various research that have been conducted in that regard. While we acknowledge that corruption exacerbates economic underdevelopment, but we cannot accurately measure to what extent that is true. And in fact, there is literature to also indicate that some see more controversially that there is some kind of corruption that is actually good for economic development. I was actually surprised to hear that. So without further ado, I would give the floor to our colleague to take us through this exciting presentation. And thank you very much, Dr. Ansa. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof, for the opening remarks. I now hand over to Dr. Munyai to present his seminar titled Political Corruption and Neo-colonialism, Obstacles Towards the Development of Africa. Dr. Ansa.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope I am audible. I just want to make a disclaimer. This paper that I'm going to present on, it's a work in progress. So some of the issues and some of the questions that I will be raising, I might not necessarily have the answers to them, but I do believe that these are questions and issues that need to be taken into consideration, and they are conversation starters. So I am looking forward to having an engagement in some of the issues that I will be raising. So since independence, since the first country in Africa gained independence, has a lot been done towards the development of Africa. Why is it that some believe or some hold the opinion that Africa is underdeveloped? And that is precisely the wave that I am going to ride for a moment, or while working on this paper. In other words, what I am going to look at what factors contribute towards the state of underdevelopment of the continent. And what I would do moving forward is just try to ask 3 questions in particular. What role does corruption have on the development of the continent? Can we attribute underdevelopment of Africa to colonialism? How does that then translate to neo-colonialism? Is it perhaps the lack of Africa not having control or ownership of her natural resources, perhaps, that is contributing to the state of underdevelopment of the continent? Are these three factors that I've just mentioned, natural resources, neo-colonialism, political corruption, are they interlinked, or they're just factors that are independent of each other? So that is what this paper is going to look at. And I just want to take a moment also to just highlight the limitations of this document or this research that I'm embarking on. So when I make reference to neo-colonialism, I'm specifically going to focus on former colonial powers or former colonial masters. And in terms of development, I'm specifically going to focus on economic development, because I hold the view that this form of development is has a crucial role to play in the overall development process. And in terms of corruption, I am specifically going to focus on political corruption, because this form of corruption is ethnic in nature and hinders the system of government. And this is the very system that is necessary and important for implementing any development or economic development agenda. Now, while on political corruption, like I said, it is systematic. It involves decision makers. It takes place in high levels of the political system. And this is where we see lawmakers and enforcers of the law, they themselves being corrupt, right? So whose interest then will they be championing? My interest, your interest, or rather their own private or personal interest? So what are the effects to this? What are the consequences then of the existence of political corruption in a state of governance? Now, political corruption undermines the political system, of course. It undermines law. It undermines and manipulates rules, it manipulates procedures, manipulates law. Like I said, it has a way of infiltrating and just the overall system of governance. And what do we expect when political corruption exists in a state of governance or in a country or in a democracy, for example? It would then lead to institutional decay. Now, with that in mind, what are before I talk about the causes, I also just want to highlight how corruption has captured how political corruption particularly has a way of capturing the stewards of democracy. And the two, in my opinion, I don't believe they are compatible. In other words, political corruption does not in any way empower politicians or those in public office, or just in general, like I said, the stewards of democracy. So if corruption has captured those in the public arena, obviously the operation of the state is going to be compromised. And as a result, democratic principles, the rule of law, like I said, is going to be undermined. The economy is going to be distorted of that particular state. Human security is going to be compromised. So now, when I take that into account and I reflect on the African continent, does political corruption exist in Africa? And to be quite honest, I do believe that it does exist. And like I said, what are the causes? What are the reasons for its existence? And there are quite a lot. We have indirect and we have direct reasons. But what I know for sure, or what I can vouch for, is that political systems that rely heavily on patronage networks, where reward supporters with government contracts, with government positions, can foster corruption. And as a result, decisions therefore are not made based on merit. Rather, they are made based on personal or political connections. So is there a formula then to combat this conundrum? And I hold the view that it's a collective responsibility. It shouldn't purely be the responsibility of politicians or those in public office, because at the end of the day, corruption in general is perpetrated not solely by politicians. Everyday corruption exists, and it has existed in such a manner that it has infiltrated deep within the social fabric. So with that in mind, then it means it should be a collective effort. What then do we know about corruption in Africa? Corruption is one of the several factors that takes a toll or has an impact on Africa's economic development, particularly having an impact on low average income countries. So, like I said, I'm going to focus on 3 factors, one of them being political corruption. So I'm just going to take a pause or take a moment and pause on that for now. Now, I want us to move forward and just unpack neo-colonialism. But before I do that, understanding the extent or just understanding neo-colonialism requires recognition and also understanding of colonialism, right? And in doing so, one would obviously also need to acknowledge Africa before it was colonized. Now, the history of Africa reveals that Africa was a continent that, you know, it was technologically and economically advanced. There were cultural and religious practices that were observed. You know, there were international economic trade systems, social systems, political systems. There was a form of governance that existed. But it's unfortunate how their difference at the time was seen as being foreign and uncivilized. That difference made Africa to be seen as less compared to whatever that it was compared to. And fast forward, we see the scramble of Africa, and you know, history shows that you know, being championed by King Leopold II of Belgium, of course, having discovered this continent with a vast natural resources. Of course, he had the intention to gain absolute control, and most definitely that led to other Western countries having interest as well and following suit. So what was the aim of it all? The aim was to exploit human and natural resources, advance Western industrialization. There was a need to control and subsequently disable existing trade, economic, political systems, like I indicated. There was a need to have such systems be under the control of Eurocentric policies. There was no intention to improve or to strengthen those existing systems. There was just a need to civilize a people that already had their own way of life or their own indigenous civilization. Now, the aftermath, what can we say about the aftermath of colonialism? And what I have found is that there are actually 2 schools of thought. On the one hand, we have those that say, look, colonial legacy exists, right? And it has negatively impacted the continent, to say that the continent is still recovering from that. It's still literally struggling to break these shackles of colonial legacy. And on the other hand, we have those who hold the opinion that, but Africa did benefit from colonialism. And I recently read one scholar who basically said that education, for example, was introduced by the colonial system, medicine, you know, religious practices that were introduced, infrastructure, for instance. And to be quite honest, when one digs deep in the history of Africa, one would actually, at the very least, should acknowledge that pharmaceutical knowledge or medicinal knowledge existed prior to colonialism. Religious and cultural practices definitely existed. Infrastructure existed, some to which are still erected to this very day. There was a form of education, of course, that was Afrocentric, definitely. So what is it? What can we say colonialism presented to Africa that Africa didn't really have at the time? So that would be an interesting conversation that I hope we will pick up later on. So what impact then did colonialism have on the economy? And there's actually quite a number of factors, but I'm just going to focus on two. One of them being foreign aid, and obviously the other being political instability. Now, in terms of foreign aid, I'm specifically going to focus on loans. And when one looks at the extent of loans that African countries have taken, they've left Africa in a state wherein it's so severe and it's unimaginable. I mean, the debt crisis that Africa has to financial institutions and Western countries, it's really enormous. So is there room for the alleviation of debt hardship? Is there room for economic growth? Now, when these loans were taken, they were taken to improve the state of the economy, but it turns out that the interest that these loans accumulate, it's just so much, particularly to low income countries. Such countries are deep in debt because they're just struggling to service that particular debt. It's almost as if these debts have held these countries at ransom, right? So how then do you expect that such countries to to progress economically, for instance? Now, the second factor that I'm going to focus on as well is political instability. I do hold the view that political instability does contribute to an economic crisis as well. There are various reasons that may lead to political instability, but more often than not, they are either centered on democratic dissatisfaction or a decay in democracy. And if there is such a dissatisfaction or decay, then such a system or such a democracy cannot promote or support any economic development agenda. Now, 66 years later, like I said, since the first country gained independence, should colonialism be blamed for everything that has gone wrong in Africa? Is that enough? What has Africa done since gaining independence? Like, what efforts have been made to push the development agenda? Not only in paper, but in reality. What lies beyond victim blaming and self-pity? And this is where I will introduce neo-colonialism. At the core of neo-colonialism is the element of influence. And this is where continued influence of colonial powers on or against their former colonial colonies. So this is where a former colonial power or colonial master has some sort of influence on a former colony that is supposedly independent. But it's important to ask the question, why? What interest would a former colonial master have on a former colony that is now independent? Now, I've realized that the motivation is somewhat similar to the purpose or the aim of colonialism, and that is to maintain or to position a former colony in a state of dependence. And this is more often motivated or as a result of, or to push an economic exploitation agenda. But again, why? Why is that the case? Now, if one acknowledges that the agenda for the scramble was, to contribute to Western industrialization, then surely then now one would say the agenda for neo-colonialism is motivated by the fact that Western economies were built on efforts of their former colonies. In other words, resources that were extracted from former colonial territories contribute towards the progression of Western Western economies. So if that is the case, then can we then say that African states are truly independent to begin with? Perhaps the conversation should start, because neo-colonialism is characterized by two things: the element of dependence and also the element of interference. Now, when interference, I think it's very important, when reflecting on the African continent, neo-colonialism, does it exist? To what extent does it exist? One would then have to measure its existence. And I found 4 tools that I would then use to try to measure its existence, and if it does exist, to what extent does it exist, and the impact of that particular existence. So the first tool that I'm going to be looking at is economic influence, right? So this is where I'm actually going to look at the presence of, for instance, a trade agreement that exists between a former colonial state and its former colonial master. Are there any economic agreements or trade agreements that are there? Do they have patterns of, colonial trade patterns, for example? That is what I'm going to be looking at. Political interference. Is there an African state, or is there a situation on the African continent wherein a former colonial power is somewhat interfering with the politics of that particular state? Why? Why is the case? What benefit does it have to that former colony? If, for instance, a former colonial power is supporting one political party, I need to understand and find out why this particular leader, why this particular political party, and not the others. The third factor that I'm going to be looking at would be financial dependence. Is there a presence of monetary control, or monetary imperialism systems? So I'll be looking at that. Is there an element of colonial tax that some African countries are actually unfortunately paying? Military presence as well. So those are the 4 factors or 4 tools that I will be looking at to measure the extent, the presence and extent of neo-colonialism in Africa. Now, the third element that I did indicate I will talk about is natural resources. Now, natural resources and development, they are intertwined, and and that is precisely the reason why I chose to include natural resources in the hope of trying to highlight the role that they play in the development of the continent. But where does inequality fit in that conversation? So when one speaks of natural resources, one would also acknowledge wealth, right? And within the context of a society, one cannot ignore the issue relating to the distribution of that wealth in a societal context. Now, why is that important? I think it's important because when a wide inequality gap exists, that contributes to, or that hinders or has an impact on the development of a state, because the people or certain people or certain groups in society that are on the far end of that equation, when their efforts of development or aid that is at play or that are being implemented or enforced, they are going to use any opportunity possible to secure their wealth, to maintain that wealth. Why? Because they are at the far end of inequality. And that is where, for example, corruption finds its way and creeps in and infiltrates in such opportunist situations. Now, with that in mind, then, within the context of natural resources, what do we know? What we know is that colonialism has influenced the control of natural resources and the alienation of natural resources. There was an introduction of political systems and the infiltration of local institutions. Now, how is that important, or how does that relate to Africa? Why are natural resources important in Africa? And I hold the view that natural resources are central to the African continent. They are central and key when one reflects on her wealth. They are central to the daily lives of the majority of Africans. And the history of Africa has shown that natural resources have played quite a pivotal role in the economy and also the sustenance of the African continent. Now, when Western powers then captured, exploit Africa's human and natural resources, it transformed right over those resources. It transformed how those natural resources were being utilized. Now, can we then attribute current inequality gaps with the consequences of exploitation of natural resources? Can we attribute this unequal access to natural resources to colonialism, for example? What about pre-colonial inequality? Shouldn't that also be acknowledged? Can we say that perhaps the colonial agenda just made pre-existing inequality worse? For example, is there a link, for instance, between current high levels of poverty and the colonial legacy? So when speaking about natural resources, I will also explore the right to permanent sovereignty over natural resources. And this is basically a right that grants states and people to dispose freely of their natural resources. But now, how is that going to be possible? Is that practical? Now, I recently found a Nigerian law that basically prohibits foreigners from directly owning land. And in my opinion, I think that is the step in the right direction. This is a country that has taken a decision to take part in controlling ownership of its natural resources. I'm also going to look at Shriver's submission. And I do agree that natural resources are important for national development, but then it must be done properly. It must be managed properly. We must also we must align the usage also with the principle of sustainable use in order to secure and not compromise the rights of future generations. So I'm also going to look at, and this is just in support of my argument on natural resources, I'm going to look at the dominial ownership theory. And this is a theory that basically states that a sovereign should possess ownership and control of its natural resources. But I'm going to ask, to what effect would this have on the continent? In the current state of Africa, would this work? And to be quite honest, I don't think it can work, because there are greater threats that exist that will compromise the exercise of this right. And that is precisely where corruption as well comes into play. The level of disregard, the level of the abuse of power and authority, those in government and those connected to those in government, that is a problem, and that is where the threat lies. Now, when highlighting the importance of development, I'm definitely going to have a look at Agenda 2063, its blueprint, and also the projects. But one thing that I want to highlight as well is I realized that when one talks about development, it's actually quite subjective. And more often than not, when you say something is developed, you're actually comparing it to something else. And that is where we see, or I've seen, arguments that, like I said, but Africa has benefited from colonialism, and because of that, Africa is developed and modernized. But now the question should be, who determine the standards of modernization then? Who are we comparing Africa to lead to that conclusion that Africa is not developed, for instance? So with that in place, or with that notion out of the way, natural resources, like I said, Africa's natural resources were exploited to develop the West, to improve, to contribute to Western industrialization. But what about the reverse of that notion? Why shouldn't Africa harness her own natural resources to develop her own continent? Why is that not explored more? Is it simple? Of course not. Is it a quick fix? No, I don't think so, because like I said, there are so many current deficiencies that exist. And at the core of it all, in my opinion, I do believe lies in the respect of institutions and also the disregard of laws, or just the essence of democracy. Now, I will align that argument with the Declaration of the Right to Development, and I'll also align this argument with the right to self-determination. And this is very important because this right highlights how people should be in a position to determine their own form of economic, cultural, and social progression. So if all these rights, the right to development, the right to self-determination, the right to permanent sovereignty over natural resources, if those rights are really exercised in Africa, but still having an influence of neo-colonialism, is Africa really free from its colonial masters and exploitation? Has Africa really recovered from Western oppression? What role can this right to permanent sovereignty have to achieve continental development? And like I said, this right positions both the state and the people to freely dispose their natural resources. And that, to me, translates to the right to self-determination. And that somehow creates this full circle of the decolonization process, right? So then Africa should take or position itself and take and seize this opportunity to unburden herself of the state of poverty that she is in, unburden herself from financial dependence syndrome, so to speak, underdevelopment, and just take and have the courage to take her natural resources and empower herself to be in a state or to achieve sustainable political and also obviously economic development as well. So with all of that said and done, with the history of colonialism and neo-colonialism, with the history of colonialism in place and its aim and its consequences, and just acknowledging how natural resources was fundamental or had a contributing factor, that should be translated to the African continent as well. I do believe the reverse of that is actually quite possible. Are these three factors, neo-colonialism, political corruption, and natural resources, interlinked or intertwined? I do believe that they are. And what could be the possible solutions? If African states can work towards strengthening, and I can only speak, based on the system of governance that African states have, and that is mostly democracy. If there is a commitment, an active political will to strengthen democratic systems in order to combat this culture of manipulation of law and systems, then I do believe that Africa does stand a chance. Corruption, the thing about corruption is it involves the element of greed. And if that is something that African states, African leaders work on, then I do believe that Africa can be a step forward. If African states can understand what motivates the need to self-enrich at the expense of others, I do believe that the African continent can then stand a chance to steer the ship towards economic and development, and perhaps just development as a whole. So with that said, that is the end of my presentation. So I'm looking forward to engagement, questions, conversations, more especially. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to how far I've come in writing this paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anza, for such an insightful and thought-provoking presentation. We will now move on to the question and answer session, which will be facilitated by myself and Ms. Tracy Ain Oliphant. So we will be alternating between the chat room and the online participants and the participants who are at the venue. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat box or to raise your hands for those who are online, and also those who are at the venue, just raise your hand and you'll be given the opportunity to ask your questions or make a comment or observation. Are there any questions at this point for Dr. Anza?
Hello, Dr. and everyone inside. My name is Michael Golo, and you spoke of the theory that I just forgot what you called, but I translated it as nationalization. When you were speaking to the natural resources of Africa and how we can play with that, and you said that we don't necessarily believe that it's possible to be able to nationalize, but you use the word nationalization, use the word that I forgot. And then you said you don't think it's possible in the current climate or context of Africa because of corruption and everything around us going on. So I would just like you to expand on that. Why would you think that nationalization would be the way to reclaim African resources? And if you don't think it's the way to reclaim them, is there any other way that you think would be possible for Africans to reclaim African resources?
Okay. The theory that I highlighted was the dominial theory, and I do agree that it somewhat speaks to nationalization. The reason why I argued that, in the current African climate, that will work is because, like I said, when it comes to, I don't have a problem with nationalization, by the way, right? But I hold the view that for as long as the corruption conundrum is still an issue, for as long as and I prefer to call them the stewards of, they are motivated by greed, whatever agenda that will be set in place, it won't work because nationalization requires a recognition of a sense of community, a collective ownership. And if that mentality is not recognized, if African leaders and those in power, or perhaps just even people in general, because when you speak of corruption, like I said, it's not a political problem because it exists even in everyday life. So if all Africans don't recognize the importance of of community, of the collective, the power that a collective has, then any agenda, like I said, to nationalize, it won't work because it will end up being used to self-preserve. And once the element of self exists, then the element of community will just it will just fall away, so to speak. So yeah, I don't think it can't work. I think it's also wrong to argue that it can't work. It can work. Just need to work on what motivates greed. And I think I read somewhere where one scholar said that perhaps the element of greed is motivated by the years and years of struggle, and to what extent that is true or that is correct, I don't know, but there's just a problem with the need to self-preserve. And I don't think that will complement or assist any national or collective agenda, in my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor, for such an interesting conversation. For us, it was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah.
I like how you were also responding to the question of nationalization. A thought just came to my mind that we are looking at this whole neo-colonialism. Within the space of government, the political control, the political corruption, which is part of what we then find ourselves as African countries exposed to the influence of population within our country. So would we then say maybe nationalization is not being perfect with capitalism? With capitalism, with the sphere of government, we have better approaches, and private individuals will still include other powerful individuals from outside Africa who would have influence in African resources. And that's the same thing we are finding in organization in the political division of it. Maybe if we go on that point. Anyway, I like the diagnosis which you made right out for the FTS, the financial system of Africa. That you think Africa ready to be fully independent, to be able to run its resources in control without a type of population? Should we say as Africa want to house anything one we have essentially, are we likely to succeed within ourselves, apart from the political corruption, within the resources exposed to ourselves? We have the means to maintain and sustain, or we still have that independent dependence. When we feel that we are staying aside, then we still need a charge for the population here and there. The hope is there for us to be able to really get this thing. How do we control the resources of the former oppressor as the free people? Or how do we use the tools of the oppressor to liberate ourselves? Where the growing trend is impossible. If we really push that, what's the view on that? And I thought I just questioning that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for your comments and questions. I think one should recognize the the power of limitation. It's crucial that how can I put it? Like it's important to understand the implications of limiting African efforts. You know, what is it that we think the West or powerful countries or states, like you said, that can do that African states cannot do, to be quite honest. And this requires what determines their efforts as efforts that can work and African efforts be deemed not to be working. Apart from, like I said, I don't believe that there's a straightforward answer. Some of these problems are just interconnected. You know what I mean? If, for instance, we deal or understand the impact and implications of what some call the inferiority complex, that I believe can contribute in moving forward. The re-engineering of the mind and just being able to because it cannot be that states that don't own natural resources be capable of controlling how they are extracted and utilized. I do believe if Africa can just shy away and just relieve itself of being incapable and just position itself and perhaps learning how Western powers are able to take charge, come in, take control, infiltrate, and do all of these things. Perhaps just taking such systems and such approaches, right, and just aligning it with the African agenda, or just aligning it with, or just have such systems be Afrocentric. Then I do believe that it can work, because like I said, at the end of the day, the global economy, the contribution of Africa on the global economy is truly enormous. And it's very important that the source where these resources are being extracted takes charge and be part of the conversation at the table, and not just what some say you know, get scraps of the conversation. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions? Oh, okay.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Just you mentioned you made reference to institutions. I was just wondering your take on at the ongoing 78th session of the UN General Assembly. We hear African president one after the other making reference to the justice and fairness of institutions of global governance. And so I was wondering if you think that the current moment presents an opportunity for Africa, I mean the current crisis in institutions of global governance, and that includes the political, economic, and financial, and legal, and architecture. Where Africa can take the opportunity to sort of reshape that architecture for its own benefit.
Sorry, can you just repeat your question?
Or
is there a comment?
Yeah, my comment is that African leaders, including current institutions of global governance, including financial institutions like IMF, the World Bank, that they are unfair, both in composition and implementation of their policies. In fact, design of their policies by nature disadvantage Africa and developing countries in general. So they want reform of these global institutions so that they will be fairer, more representative, and more inclusive.
Yeah.
So, since you're talking about neo-colonialism and political corruption, so I'm asking whether you think this particular crisis in the international political and legal order creates an opportunity for Africa to try and redesign or reconfigure these global institutions, and if so, how should Africa go about it? If you look at the rights permanent right to natural resources and sovereignty over natural resources, this struggle on the one hand, on the other hand, the struggle for a new international economic order. So the reason, and that is where I sort of not really fully agree with you, that the reason Africa's condition is the way it is due to this global architecture we're talking about, that it's designed in such a way that those who have natural resources are not in a position to control their natural resources, because you mentioned financial influence, and that refers to financial institutions controlling your economy, whether it's through fiscal policy or monetary policies or whatever. When the dollar goes up and goes down, I mean, how do you explain that? So that's financial institution on the one side. Then even if you look at legal institutions, for example, if they're going to make a decision that, I mean, take the case of Libya. South Africa was very opposed to intervention in Libya, right? But France, the US, and other Western countries were in support of the intervention in Libya. So at the end, they carried the day. Why? Because the legal institution, which is the UN Security Council, said there should be intervention. So even though 54, or let's say 50 African countries said no, 3 Western countries said yes, and theirs became the law. So that's another legal gymnastics that I can't understand. If you take it to political, I mean, no matter how you look at it, system is structured in such a way that you think you are independent, but you're actually not independent. Whether economically, politically, legally, otherwise. So that's just my point of difference. So otherwise, an excellent presentation.
Yeah, I think you have, and I do agree, and I do acknowledge that the in the bigger scheme of things, the global system in itself is just somewhat skewed. How the level of politics and how power just changes the trajectory or the trajectory of events, or how power contributes in just the functioning of the globe, for example. So yes, I do agree that there is perhaps a need to change, to reform the global structure. I think also another important thing as well is for African states as well to speak not as individual states, but also as a collective. I do believe that it can actually play a role, because that will have that can somewhat contribute to a collective representation of African interests and not necessarily individual states as well. So the element of collective, I do believe, is key or important. Right. I don't think there are any more questions. Unless online.
Thank you, Dr. Anza. Do we have any questions from the online participants?
No.
Okay. If there are no more questions, we will move on to the closing remarks by Prof. E. Sorry?
There's just one.
Okay.
You're in person? In person.
Okay.
Good day, everyone. For your
Okay.
I really enjoyed it. My name is Magnus. I'd like to clarify one thing that I had from previous. You mentioned that you agree with the Nigerian law with foreigners and students from only levels. But then also you state that you're against the Colombian ownership theory. For me, it seems like the theory for the Nigerian law basically speaks to nationalism, and you sort of agree with that. But then you disagree with the Colombian ownership theory. The right is that.
I actually said in supporting my argument for exercising the right to permanent sovereignty over natural resources, I am going to align that argument with the dominion theory. Yeah. Okay. All right.
We still have time on the program. So if there are more questions or comments from the venue online, please do go ahead and ask.
Nothing from the venue.
Okay. All right. I don't see anything online either. So we will move on to the closing remarks by Prof. E. Prof. E, over to you. Sorry, there is something in the chat box from Bulelani. Bulelani says that the control or ownership of natural resources in itself does not create wealth and thus development, but the value created from those natural resources is what creates wealth and thus development. We do not have capacity of any form for value creation. We do not have both soft and hard infrastructure for that. E.g., the value of cobalt is in the battery that is created out of it. How is this impacted by the differences you spoke about? Dr. Anza?
Right, thank you. I disagree. I think natural resources translates to wealth, and I think I did mention that. I also think it's important, for example, just the element of infrastructure that was part of the question. The infrastructure development or progression will not, or it will be hindered if the state itself doesn't control the resources for that particular infrastructure. So in other words, if a country owns resources, material that are key to infrastructure, for example, materials that are important or that are used for cement, for example, right? If a state owns such materials and has control over it, then I do believe that can contribute towards the hard infrastructure and subsequently, you know, the the manufacturing processes and all of that particular natural resource. So I don't necessarily believe that owning such natural resources doesn't create wealth. I do believe just having a say in the extraction and the usage of that particular resource does somewhat give states the element of wealth. Of course, the interaction or not really the interaction, but the export and the trade agreements and exchanges that countries might have, of course, that will play a huge role in the financial benefit of selling what we have. But it's a bit of an error for a country to have an extraction agreement with another state and have the product of that natural resource be sold back to the state of extraction. That to me is a bit skewed. I hold the view and opinion that states should have control and contribute and make an effort to have resources, to have systems in place to contribute or to take part in the extraction and the development, and then trading the products to other states, and not vice versa. That equation, it's just not, it's not proper. Thank you.
A question, please, or maybe an observation.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Munyai, for such a wonderful and thought-provoking presentation. Looking across Africa now, we see most countries requiring that the natural resources being exploited from Africa should be transformed in Africa, meaning it will, in one way or the other, be beneficial and probably induce the development we are craving for. However, there is this thought, because most of these investments are going to be done by multinational corporations. And there is this study that has proven that these multinational corporations, they only leave a few enriched persons in a nation, in a country, or in a state, and this causes a humanitarian as well as environmental and ecological damage to the populations. Furthermore, and to a greater extent, it plunges back the state that we are struggling to develop into underdevelopment. Now, maybe I don't know our stance or your stance particularly on this. And should we begin to think of another strategy that these resources, instead of allowing the multinational corporations come and settle to exploit, should we Africans, or should we not, be the ones to do the exploitation and the transformation and just do business with whomsoever is coming? Thank you.
Thank you. I thank you so much for your comment and your question. The thing I do agree to some extent when it comes to multinational corporations, right? And I think it's also quite important to take note that at the end of the day, the agenda for these multinational organizations is profit. So whether or not or how such mineral extractions, like we indicated, have an impact on the environment, how will the business agenda affect the general population? That is not a priority for such corporations. And it's quite also unfortunate how the extent and influence of such corporations have on sectors of some African countries. How they influence, how such corporations influence a particular sector or an economy of the state. That is actually quite it's unbelievable, to be quite honest. And so how then do we expect states to progress when the very essence of its functioning or its economy, it's directed or pushed by certain or even one corporation? And that is also where, just to bring the element of greed as well, that is also where now we see certain political leaders or public officials being captured as well, because there's an incentive or benefit that they would get if certain economic policies are being pushed to a certain direction. So I think it's very important as well to recognize the level of influence that such corporations have. And I also don't believe that the interests of such corporations and national development or national interest can move together or be aligned. One would have to be on the far end of whatever benefits that are at play, or at the far end of the agenda that is being pushed or promoted.
Okay, thank you. Sandra Miller has a question to ask. Please go ahead and ask your question, Sandra. I hope that you have been well answered, Gilbert.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Okay, so my question is this, that it seems to me that the United Nations and these national companies have not recognized neo-colonialism. Of course, they talk about political corruption, but they haven't recognized neo-colonialism as one of the issues, fundamental issues that contribute to lack of development in Africa. So I see they're still stuck on like natural, global environmental changes and everything, but they haven't really recognized that their actions are fundamental part of underdevelopment in Africa. I also noted that in the conversation that Prof had on YouTube with the newscaster, whereby Prof was saying, you really have to be on ground to understand the impact of this thing that's happening in Niger. So meaning you really have to be an African in Africa undergoing the struggle to understand what we're talking about. So my question is, how do we get this specific challenge to these people that are causing this problem? How do we make them hear? And how can we make them hear us that they are fundamental part of the reason why we are where we are today in Africa? Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Sandra, for your question. I think The first part of your comment that it seems as if the United Nations and the West don't seem to recognize neo-colonialism as a problem. Perhaps as a conversation starter, a follow-up question should be why? Why is that? Why is there a lack of recognition? But on the other hand, I think before, trying to speak out or trying to be heard, I think it's important just for African states to first acknowledge the existence of neo-colonialism first. I think once there is an acknowledgement that, you know what, there is a sense of influence. We might be independent on paper, but we don't think that we have control or, are truly independent or sovereign. And I think once that acknowledgement, once that position is acknowledged, then we can, try to make efforts to make it known that, all ties, all financial ties, political ties, economic ties, now they are being severed. How that can be possible, I don't think there is a watertight procedure or a plan, but I do believe that it starts with recognizing that there is a problem. This thing is really in existence, it is in motion, and it's not in any way benefiting the continent. So it's time to sever the cord. It's time to truly be sovereign. And I think in speaking or advocating for sovereignty, it's also important for African states to also recognize the power of being a collective, because these are states that share a similar history. These are states that shared, that are impacted, that share this colonial legacy. So it's going to be difficult to try to make Western states listen or acknowledge the impact of their influence as one state against Western states. I mean, they are also a collective on their own, but just the power of a collective of African states, the importance of what I just recently read, which is collective self-reliance. That is actually quite an important and powerful tool that African states as well should recognize and appreciate and just use it, to progress, not only as I said individual states, but just as a collective. So yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much. So
there's just
one more. Okay, so I think that will be the last one, because we were supposed to finish the question and answer at 13:25. So we will take that last question and move on to it.
Thank you, Dr. Munyang, for the presentation.
Yeah.
I think you just summarized everything I was about to say now, which is the fact that we fail to realize that a lot of the African states that were colonized, colonialism still has a very big impact, even after we gained independence and we are living in a democratic country. And if now people are saying it doesn't have an effect, or why do we keep on blaming colonialism when it happened years back, we should look at how people still have still had the wealth that they acquired through colonialism. They still have it till today. And if now we're saying it doesn't have an impact, then that means when we were gained democracy, then we should be in an equal footing with them. But because most of the wealth that they acquired, I won't say white people, most of the wealth that they acquired through colonialism and in South Africa and even through apartheid, they still have it. And if now we're saying no, South Africa is free and we should stop blaming colonialism and in South Africa apartheid, then it means white people and black people should be on the same footing about it. It's not that. And I also feel like what's killing African states the most is individualism. And as you say, if we come together as a collective and we find this and together, then we maybe step ahead. But because a lot of African states run a very individualism way, I don't think we will we will be able to actually
I get you. Yeah. I get you. And I definitely agree. And I also just want to make a point. Just 1 second. Yeah, okay. I also just in closing just want to, make a point that African states also should ask themselves, or at least recognize why neo-colonialism exists and whether or not Western or former colonial masters will actually let go freely. I think that is also, if we can at least recognize that it might not be as easy as them saying, you know what, this is it, but just recognizing and trying to understand their sense of reasoning. Why will former colonial masters really leave Africa willingly? I think that question is quite important for African states to try to ponder. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Anza. And thank you everyone for taking your time to attend this seminar. I will ask Prof. E to give the closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moyai, and a warm thank you and gratitude to our presenter for today, and also all of you that took time out to attend, those physically present at the venue and those who joined the online platform. Thank you very much, and we appreciate your continued support to our work. I will look forward to seeing you again in our next event, which should be in a couple of months. So this work is this. We have nice refreshment. You can join us. Thank you very much and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. Thank you everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Blessed weekend to everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Okay, Tracy. Tracy.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Someone asked in the chat box if the recording is going to be distributed to the.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. It will be after we have edited, just starting and then finishing this part. Then it will be shared on different platforms.
Okay. All right. No, that's fine.
Can we stop recording?